If you've ever poured your entire soul into a job, if you've ever sacrificed your nights and weekends, not for a paycheck, but because you believed in the mission, then you need to hear this. You need to know what happens when the people who sign those paychecks decide your belief is a liability. My name is Mallory, and this is the story of how I was fired from the job I loved and how I got it back with interest. It all started the day they tried to make me the executioner of my own newsroom. I was senior editor of the Oak City Ledger, and I said no. They thought that was the end of the story. They were wrong. So stick with me, and if any of this feels familiar, if you've ever felt that sting of being undervalued, let me know in the comments. It helps to know you're not just screaming into the void. The air in Arthur Vance's office always smelled like a new car. It was a sterile plastic and leather scent that had nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with the corporate parent company, Sterling Media Group, that had installed him 6 months ago. He was a turnaround specialist, a title that sounds like a miracle worker but really just means hatchet man. He sat across his vast, empty mahogany desk, a desk that had once belonged to my mentor David and was now just a landing strip for Arthur's ego. He steepled his fingers, a gesture he'd probably learned from a Power Poses for Executives seminar. He said, "Mallory, we appreciate your passion. That was always the prelude to a knife twisting. Your dedication to the ledger is admirable." He let the word hang in the air, freighted with condescension, as if my dedication were a charming but hopelessly outdated hobby, like collecting stamps or believing in the goodness of people. I just stared. I didn't give him a nod or a reassuring smile. I'd learned early on that with men like Arthur, any sign of agreeableness was interpreted as a sign of weakness. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to be the one to fill it. It's a simple reporter's trick. People are terrified of empty space in a conversation, and they will rush to fill it with the truth, or at least their version of it. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the soundproofed office. As you know, print media is facing significant headwinds. We need to be lean. We need to be agile. He was reciting the gospel of corporate decline, the holy texts of downsizing. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood. It wasn't a spreadsheet or a report. It was a list of names. There were 12 of them. I didn't need to read it closely. I knew who they would be. I saw Brenda's name. She was our copy chief, a woman with 40 years of institutional memory, who could spot a factual error from 100 paces, and whose quiet presence was the only thing standing between us and a lawsuit on any given Tuesday. I saw Mark's name, our only dedicated photographer, a man who could find the soul of the city in a single frame. I saw 2 of our best investigative reporters, the ones who did the kind of deep-dive, thankless work that didn't generate clicks, but held the powerful to account. And I saw Liam's name. That was the one that made my blood run cold. Liam was my kid, my project, a brilliant, hungry reporter I'd hired right out of J-school 2 years ago. He was tenacious and idealistic, a rare combination, and he was knee-deep in a story about zoning variances and kickbacks at City Hall that was not only important, it was dangerous. It was the kind of story that newspapers are supposed to exist for. It was also the kind of story that scared advertisers and made powerful people make angry phone calls. Arthur said, "We're restructuring the newsroom to create a more dynamic, digitally focused content generation hub." The words were meaningless, a smokescreen of jargon designed to obscure the simple, brutal reality. They were gutting us. They were turning a newspaper into a content farm. I pushed the list back across the desk. I said, "No." It was the only word I spoke. It landed on the mahogany with a thud. Arthur's practiced smile tightened at the edges. He wasn't used to that word. He was used to memos and meetings and passive-aggressive compliance. He wasn't used to a simple 2-letter roadblock. He said, "I don't think you understand, Mallory. This isn't a suggestion. This is the new structure. Your role as senior editor will be to manage the transition, to communicate the corporate vision, My role is to protect the integrity of the newspaper, I said, my voice dangerously calm, and these cuts will destroy it. You're not cutting fat, Arthur. You're cutting bone. You're cutting the heart. His eyes went flat. The mask of the collaborative manager slipped, revealing the cold-blooded accountant beneath. The decision has been made, he said, his tone shifting from patronizing to menacing. It was made at a level far above this office. You are an employee of Sterling Media. Your job is to execute the directives of your employer. If you are unable to do that, he let the sentence trail off, another one of his pathetic little power plays. I am the editor of the Oak City Ledger. I corrected him, or I was. I stood up. My hands were steady. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but he would never see it. If you want to burn this place to the ground for the insurance money, you'll have to find someone else to light the match. I turned and walked out of his office, closing the door quietly behind me. I didn't slam it. I think that disappointed him. He wanted a scene, a hysterical woman he could dismiss. I gave him nothing. I walked through the newsroom, the vast, open-plan space that felt more like a tomb than a creative hub these days. The lights were always dim now. Another one of Arthur's cost-saving measures. I saw the faces of the people on that list. Brenda, peering at a proof through her bifocals. Mark, cleaning his camera lenses. Liam, hunched over his keyboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. They were all so focused on their work, on the mission, they didn't know they were already ghosts. I didn't go to my desk. I went to the elevator. As I stepped in, I saw Arthur emerge from his office. He had his phone to his ear. He looked at me through the closing doors, and for the first time he let himself have a real expression. It was a sneer of pure, triumphant contempt. He thought he had won. He thought he had removed the ringleader, the last line of defense. He thought the problem was solved. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that my final act as editor wasn't that quiet no in his office. My final act had taken place over the last 6 weeks, in hushed conversations in the stairwell, in encrypted text messages, in late-night meetings at a dive bar across town where the vinyl on the booths was cracked and no one from management would ever dream of setting foot. My final act was to take the soul of that newsroom, the collective belief and frustration and fear, and give it a voice, and a shield. The elevator doors closed, and my reflection in the polished steel was a stranger's. A woman who was, for all intents and purposes, unemployed. But there was something else in her eyes, too, a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was the quiet, cold hum of a machine that had just been switched on. The vote was already in motion. The ballots were being counted. He thought he'd cut the head off the snake. He had no idea he'd just handed it a sword and a shield. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was not the end. It was the beginning of the war. The drive home was a blur. I remember the sickly yellow of the streetlights smearing across the windshield, the rhythm of the wipers keeping time with the frantic thumping in my chest. I parked in my designated spot, turned off the engine, and just sat there in the sudden deafening silence of my garage. And that's when it hit me. The composure, the cold anger, the strategic calm, it all shattered at once, like a pane of glass struck by a stone. A wave of nausea and grief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over me. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, the cheap plastic cool against my skin, and I started to shake. It wasn't just a job. It was my life. It was my identity. For 15 years, the Oak City Ledger had been my home, my family, my purpose. I had started as a cub reporter, fresh out of college, terrified and thrilled, and so hopelessly in love with the clatter of keyboards and the smell of fresh newsprint. David Miller, my predecessor, had hired me. He was a legend, a classic newspaperman, with ink-stained fingers and a bottle of bourbon in his bottom drawer. He believed that journalism was a public trust, a sacred calling. He used to say, "Mallory, we're not in the business of selling papers. We're in the business of building a better city. We are the conscience of this place." He had been my mentor, my champion. I remembered the day he promoted me to city editor. He'd taken me to his office, the same office Arthur now occupied, and poured 2 small glasses of that bourbon. He raised his glass and said, "To keeping the bastards honest." It was his mantra. It became mine. I learned everything from him: how to cultivate a source, how to structure a story for maximum impact, how to protect a reporter who was onto something big. He taught me that an editor's most important job wasn't just to correct grammar, but to create a fortress around the truth-tellers, to give them the time, the resources, and the air cover they needed to do the dangerous work. 5 years ago, David had retired. He'd handpicked me as his successor. His last piece of advice was a warning. Sterling Media Group had just bought the paper. He'd met the corporate guys. He'd seen the look in their eyes. "They don't see a newspaper, Mallory," he'd warned me, his voice gravelly. "They see a distressed asset. They'll talk about synergy and platforms and verticals. They'll use a lot of $10 words to describe a 5-cent idea, which is to squeeze every last drop of blood from this place, and then sell the corpse for parts. Don't let them. Fight them." And I had. Oh God, how I had fought. For 5 years it had been a constant, grinding war of attrition. A battle fought in budget meetings and conference calls. Every new hire was a struggle. Every travel request was scrutinized. Every long-term investigation was a liability. It was a slow, creeping death. The first thing to go was the international desk. Then the art section was folded into lifestyle. The book review page disappeared entirely. Each cut was a small death, a tiny chipping away at the soul of the paper. I argued. I cajoled. I presented data. I made impassioned speeches about our civic duty. Sometimes I won. More often, I just managed to slow the bleeding. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself that as long as I was there, the core mission was safe. I was the firewall. This was the source of my debatable logic. I see that now. Why did I stay? Why did I tolerate the slow dismantling of everything I loved? It was loyalty, but not to Sterling Media. It was loyalty to David's memory. It was loyalty to the city. It was a profound, perhaps foolish, belief that if I just held on, if I just worked hard enough, I could save this thing that was so much bigger than me. I was trying to keep a promise to a ghost. 6 months ago, they sent Arthur. He was different from the previous corporate minders. They had been clueless but mostly harmless. Arthur was a predator. He understood that the real value to be optimized wasn't the printing press or the website. It was the payroll. He saw the newsroom not as an engine of democracy, but as a line item on a spreadsheet. My conflict with him started almost immediately, and it centered on Liam. Liam was a special kind of reporter. He had a bloodhound's nose for a story and a poet's touch with prose. He wasn't interested in the easy clickbait, the listicles and celebrity gossip that Arthur kept pushing in our daily content strategy meetings. Liam wanted to dig. He'd stumbled onto a tip about a series of zoning changes in the rapidly gentrifying waterfront district. It looked boring on the surface: municipal code, planning commission minutes, but Liam smelled something rotten. He suspected a powerful developer, a man who happened to be one of the Ledger's biggest advertisers, and a friend of Arthur's boss, was getting preferential treatment in exchange for, well, that was the part he was still trying to nail down. Arthur wanted the story killed. His reasoning was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. He said it wasn't aligned with our brand's positive growth narrative. He said it was a poor allocation of journalistic resources. He said it exposed the paper to unnecessary legal risk. What he meant was that it was pissing off his friend. I refused. I ran interference for Liam. I approved his travel to the state capitol to dig through property records. I signed off on his subscription to a forensic accounting database. Every expense claim was a battle with Arthur. Every week Arthur would ask, "What's the status of the waterfront project? Is Liam still wasting his time on that?" And every week I would say, "He's making progress. It's a good story, we're going to run it when it's ready." I was protecting Liam, but I was also painting a target on my own back. I knew it, but it was the right thing to do. It was what David would have done. It was the entire point of having the title of editor. You don't just edit copy, you edit the reality of what's possible for your reporters. You build the walls of the fortress. Sitting there in my car, the shame washed over me. I had failed. My fortress had been breached. The list of names on Arthur's desk was his final move. He wasn't just cutting staff. He was taking out my key soldiers. Brenda, the keeper of the flame. Mark, the eye of the paper. And Liam, the tip of the spear. By putting Liam on that list, Arthur wasn't just getting rid of a reporter. He was burying a story. He was silencing a truth. And by firing me for refusing to do his dirty work, he was making sure no one would ever dare to try again. I finally managed to get out of the car and stumble into my apartment. The place was dark and quiet. I hadn't had time to build a life outside of the ledger. My friends were my colleagues. My social life was the occasional after-work drink to decompress from a tough story. My apartment was just a place to sleep before going back to the only place that felt like home. And now I was an exile. I sank onto my sofa, the silence of the room pressing in on me. The despair was a physical weight, a heavy blanket pinning me down. It was over. 15 years. All that fighting, all that sacrifice. For what? To be dismissed in a 2-minute meeting by a man who thought a newspaper was no different from a factory that makes widgets. The humiliation was a hot, bitter taste in the back of my throat. He had won. My phone, which I'd tossed onto the coffee table, buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Probably commiserations from the few people who knew. I didn't have the energy to respond, to perform the role of the graceful but wronged victim. I just wanted to disappear. But the buzzing was insistent, a frantic, rhythmic pulse. Annoyed, I reached for it, expecting to see a dozen different names. It was just one. Liam. A string of messages. The first one said, "Mallory, where are you? Arthur just called a newsroom meeting." The second, a minute later, "He's telling everyone you resigned for personal reasons." The third, "No one is buying it. The air in here is toxic." And then a fourth message, a picture of a piece of paper. It was a handwritten tally sheet, 2 columns, yes and no. The yes column was overwhelmingly longer than the no column. Underneath the tally, scrawled in black marker, were the words, "It's official." My breath caught in my throat. I sat up straight, the heavy blanket of despair suddenly feeling a little lighter. I scrolled to the final message, the one that had just come in. It was 5 simple words. "The count is in. We did it." And just like that, the grief, the shame, the despair, it didn't vanish, but it was suddenly joined by something else. Something cold and hard and clear. It was the feeling I got right before a big story broke. The adrenaline spike that sharpens your senses and slows down time. It was resolve. Arthur thought he had fired me. He thought he had ended the fight. He had no idea that I hadn't been fighting his war. I had been fighting my own. And the real battle was just about to begin. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, my fingers tracing the image of the tally on the screen. It was about taking back what was ours. The decision to organize hadn't been a single lightning strike moment. It was a slow burn, a gradual accumulation of 1,000 tiny cuts and indignities. It started not with me, but with Brenda, the copy chief. About a year ago, Sterling had implemented a new centralized payroll system. In the process, they audited the pension plans. Brenda, who was 3 years away from retirement, received a sterile automated email informing her that due to a recalculation of legacy benefits, her pension would be 30% less than what she had been promised for 40 years. It was legal, they claimed, buried in the fine print of the acquisition. It was also theft. She came to my office, the email printed out on a trembling piece of paper, her face ashen. She wasn't a fighter. She was the quiet, steady bedrock of the newsroom. But in that moment, she was terrified. I spent a week on the phone with HR drones and corporate lawyers in another state. I argued. I pleaded. I threatened to write a story about it. They were polite, immovable, and utterly indifferent. They sent me a PDF of the employee handbook. The message was clear. We hold all the cards. I managed to get them to re-examine her case, which resulted in a patronizing offer of a one-time goodwill payment that was an insult. Seeing the defeat in Brenda's eyes was one of the first times I realized that my title, my position as a firewall, was largely an illusion. I could hold back the tide, but the ocean was rising. That incident planted a seed. The idea of a union at the Ledger had always been a non-starter. Journalists, especially at older legacy papers, often have a kind of romantic, individualistic pride. We see ourselves as lone wolves, not factory workers. We believe in merit and bylines, not collective bargaining. But Sterling Media, and especially Arthur, were systematically destroying that culture. They weren't treating us like professionals. They were treating us like interchangeable parts in a content machine. The real catalyst, the moment the hushed conversations turned into a concrete plan, came about 2 months before I was fired. It was a Tuesday. Arthur had just returned from a corporate retreat in Scottsdale. He was tan and smug, and he called a mandatory newsroom meeting. He stood before us, in front of a giant projection of the new Sterling Digital First logo, and announced a pivot to video. This in itself wasn't a terrible idea, but his plan was moronic. He announced we were laying off 2 of our 3 fact-checkers to hire a social media video influencer he had met at the retreat, a 22-year-old kid whose primary skill was doing silly dances on TikTok. The room was silent with disbelief. We were a newspaper of record. We had won Pulitzers. And we were being told to gut our verification process, the very foundation of our credibility, to chase fleeting, meaningless viral fame. After the meeting, Liam, Mark the photographer, and Sarah, one of our best investigative reporters, cornered me by the coffee machine. The hiss of the espresso maker was the only sound for a long moment. Then Liam spoke, his voice tight with fury. He said, "He's going to kill this place, Mallory. He's going to turn it into BuzzFeed's ugly step-cousin." Sarah, who was older and more cynical, just shook her head. "It's not about the paper, it's about his next job. He's building a resume, successfully transitioned legacy media brand to dynamic digital platform. He doesn't care if the whole thing collapses a year after he's gone." That night, the 4 of us met at the Lamplighter, an old-school bar with dark wood and the comforting smell of stale beer. It was the kind of place reporters had been meeting to grouse and conspire in for a century. I told them about Brenda's pension. Sarah told us about how Arthur had killed her last story, a deep dive into hospital pricing, because the hospital's CEO sat on the board of another Sterling-owned company. Mark showed us an internal memo he'd been accidentally copied on, detailing a plan to replace staff photographers with a subscription to a stock photo service. It was a litany of betrayals. We weren't just employees being mismanaged, we were guardians of an institution being systematically dismantled by people who didn't understand its value. The fortress wasn't just being breached, its own commanders were selling the bricks. I said David warned me this would happen. I told them his final words to me. I confessed my own feeling of powerlessness, the slow dawning horror that my good faith arguments and passionate defenses were just noise to these people. Liam, ever the idealist, was the one who said it out loud. What if we had actual power? What if it wasn't just you, Mallory, fighting for us? What if we all fought together? And there it was. The word, union. It felt foreign, almost taboo. But in that dark booth, it also felt like the only sane response. It wasn't about wages or benefits, not really. It was about control. It was about having a legally recognized voice in the destiny of the paper. It was about codifying the very principles of journalistic integrity that Arthur was trying to erase. This was my secret plan. My foresight. It wasn't that I predicted I'd be fired, it was that I recognized the existential threat to the entire newsroom. My strategy shifted. I realized I couldn't be the lone firewall anymore. I had to arm the entire city. My role changed from defender to organizer. We were reporters. We knew how to be discreet. We knew how to build a network, verify information, and protect sources. We used those same skills to build a union. We reached out to a national newspaper guild and got connected with a veteran organizer named Frank. He was a gruff, 60-something guy with a healthy distrust of management and a PhD in labor law. He met with our small group, me, Liam, Sarah, and Brenda, who had become a quiet but powerful advocate in the back room of the Lamplighter. Frank laid it out for us. He told us it would be hard. Management would fight back with everything they had. They would use union-busting consultants. They would hold captive audience meetings filled with misinformation. They would try to pick us off one by one, to intimidate the undecided. He looked at me pointedly. They'll especially come for you, Mallory. You're management. You're not technically eligible to be in the bargaining unit, but you can be its architect. And that became my role. I was the ghost in the machine. I couldn't sign a union card, but I could guide the process. I knew the newsroom's rhythms. I knew who was trustworthy, who was on the fence, and who would be a liability. I used my editor's brain to map out the campaign. We created a spreadsheet, just like for a major investigation. It listed every eligible employee, their department, their likely leanings, and who was best positioned to talk to them. Liam was my field commander. His youthful energy and passionate belief were infectious. He had one-on-one conversations, not about abstract labor theory, but about the specific things Arthur was doing. He'd say to a sports writer, "Remember when Arthur killed your travel budget and you had to cover the playoffs from a TV screen? That's what this is about." He'd say to a designer, "Remember when they outsourced the Sunday layout to a firm in another country without even telling you? That's what this is about." He made it personal. He made it real. Sarah was our opposition researcher. She used her investigative skills to dig up information on Sterling Media's history, with other papers they'd acquired. She found articles about other union drives, other restructurings, other shattered promises. We compiled this into a briefing book, a secret document circulated among the pro-union staff, fact-checking Arthur's corporate propaganda before he even had a chance to spew it. My secret weapon, my hidden leverage, was information. As senior editor, I had access to budget projections, strategic plans, and corporate communications. I never shared a confidential document. I was scrupulous about the legal and ethical lines, but my understanding of the company's strategy allowed me to anticipate Arthur's moves. When he started talking about synergizing our regional assets, I knew it was code for closing the suburban bureaus. I could warn the organizing committee, so they could prepare the reporters in those bureaus for the fight to come. I was playing chess, using my knowledge of the board to tell my pieces where the traps were. The campaign was a masterclass in clandestine operations. We used encrypted messaging apps. We held meetings in public parks and coffee shops, far from the office. We had a code. "Are you going to the book club meeting?" meant a union planning session. "Did you read the latest draft of the features memo?" was a query about a new piece of organizing literature. The hardest part was keeping my own growing anger and fear in check. I had to continue to go to work every day, to sit in meetings with Arthur, to listen to his jargon-filled monologues, all while knowing that I was helping to build a rebellion under his nose. There were days I was so filled with rage I could barely speak. There were nights I lay awake, convinced we would be discovered and I would be fired and blacklisted. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself it was a strategic necessity. It was the only tool we had left. The plan was to hold the vote, and if we won, to present our certification to management as a fait accompli. We knew a long, drawn-out campaign would give Arthur too much time to fight back. We needed speed and surprise. We collected the signed union cards secretly over a period of 3 weeks. Frank, the organizer, told us we needed signatures from at least 30% of the staff to file for an election with the National Labor Relations Board. By the end, we had signatures from over 70%. We had a silent supermajority. We filed the petition on a Monday. The election was scheduled for the following Friday. It all happened incredibly fast, which was part of our strategy. Arthur was completely blindsided. He got the official notification from the NLRB and, according to Liam, went ballistic. He called an emergency all-hands meeting and delivered a rambling, threatening speech about how a union would be a third party that would come between us and create an adversarial environment. It was boilerplate union-busting nonsense, and it backfired. People who had been on the fence saw his panic and realized we were onto something. His threats solidified our support. The vote itself was held in a drab conference room, with an agent from the NLRB presiding. It was a simple paper ballot, yes or no. I wasn't there, of course. I was in my office, trying to pretend it was a normal Friday. The tension was unbearable. That afternoon, Arthur called me into his office. That was the meeting. The one where he slid the list of names across the desk. Looking back, I see his terrible, beautiful timing. He didn't know about the vote count. He just knew I was his main obstacle. In his mind, by firing me, he was preemptively crushing any future resistance. He was solving the Mallory problem. He had no idea that the Mallory problem was no longer the issue. The issue was now the newsroom problem. A unified, organized, and legally protected newsroom. He thought he was playing the final move in his game, but he was actually just tripping the first wire in mine. The official email arrived at 9:01 a.m. on Monday morning. I was in my apartment, sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee I couldn't taste. My laptop was open. My phone was face up beside it. For the past day and a half, I had been in constant quiet communication with Liam and Frank, the union organizer. After the initial thrill of the victory text, a cold, anxious reality had set in. Winning the vote was one thing. Wielding that power was another entirely. Frank had been clear. Our first move had to be decisive. It had to be bold. It had to reframe the entire conflict, not as a matter of corporate restructuring, but as a matter of illegal retaliation. He'd said, "They fired your leader. You have to make it clear that the union's first and most fundamental demand is that they undo that. It's not a negotiation point. It's the price of admission to the bargaining table." There was some debate about this. A few of the more timid members of the new union committee felt it was too aggressive. They thought we should start with smaller asks, like rescinding the layoffs. It was a classic case of thinking like the oppressed. They were still asking for permission. I had been firm, through Liam as my proxy. I told them, Arthur's move to fire me wasn't about the budget, it was about fear. It was a show of force to terrorize the rest of you. If you let it stand, you have already lost. Your first act as a union cannot be to accept his most flagrant act of union busting. You have to throw it right back in his face. It's the only language he understands. My logic, debatable to some, was that this was no longer a negotiation. It was a war. You don't start a war by asking the enemy for a small concession. You start it by taking back the hill they just captured. Frank's legal team had drafted the letter. It was a work of art, a short, brutally efficient piece of prose. It was addressed to Arthur Vance and the Sterling Media Group legal department. It stated, very simply, that the employees of the Oak City Ledger had voted to unionize under the banner of the Newspaper Guild. It cited the official certification from the NLRB, and then it got to the point. The letter stated that the union had reason to believe that the termination of senior editor Mallory Kane on the day of the union election was an act of illegal retaliation against a perceived organizer, a violation of the National Labor Relations Act. It went on to say that as a condition for avoiding an immediate unfair labor practice charge with the NLRB and a simultaneous newsroom-wide strike, the union had one single, non-negotiable preliminary demand: the immediate and full reinstatement of Mallory Kane to her position, with back pay, and her promotion to the vacant role of editor-in-chief. That last part was my little addition. It was a move of pure, calculated audacity. The editor-in-chief position had been empty since David retired. Sterling had been too cheap to fill it, instead lumping the responsibilities onto me as senior editor, without the title or the pay. By demanding it now, we weren't just asking for the status quo back. We were demanding a power shift. We were saying, not only do you have to put our leader back, you have to give her the authority she should have had all along. It was a power play, plain and simple. At 9:02 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Liam. The email is out. Frank's lawyer just CC'd the entire bargaining unit. I took a deep breath. The first shot had been fired. Now, we waited for the echo. Liam became my eyes and ears, sending me a running commentary via text. 9:15 a.m. Total silence in the newsroom. Everyone is just staring at their screen. No one is typing. You can hear a pin drop. 9:22 a.m. Arthur just stormed out of his office. He's on his phone. He looks purple. 9:30 a.m. He's calling an emergency meeting. Conference room in 5. This is it. I pictured the scene. The drab conference room. The flickering fluorescent lights. The worn-out chairs. Arthur standing at the front, his face a mask of fury. And the newsroom staff, my staff, filing in. But this time, they weren't filing in as a collection of scared individual employees. They were filing in as a single, unified entity. They were the union. Liam's texts became more sporadic as the meeting started. 9:45 a.m. He's screaming. Not literally, but his voice is shaking. He's calling the demand an insult, calling it an amateurish stunt. 9:48 a.m. He's saying Mallory Kane is not, and will never again be, an employee of this company. He's pointing at people, saying the union is filling your heads with poison. 9:51 a.m. Brenda just stood up. Oh my God, Brenda. My heart leaped into my throat. Brenda, the quiet one, the bedrock. 9:53 a.m. She just spoke. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard her. She said, Arthur, you tried to take my pension. Mallory fought for me. This union is fighting for all of us, and we have decided that Mallory is our editor. That is our position. Then she sat down. I could have wept with pride. It was a moment of pure, unscripted courage. Brenda, who had been a victim of the system, had just found her voice and spoken truth to power. She had shown them all the way. 10 a.m. It's over. He lost the room. After Brenda spoke, nobody was scared of him anymore. People were just looking at him with contempt. He started talking about legal action, but his voice had no conviction. He just dismissed everyone and stomped back to his office. The panic had set in. Arthur was an accountant dressed up as a leader. He knew how to read a balance sheet and intimidate an underling. He had no idea how to handle a collective rebellion. His playbook was useless. He was used to picking off his targets one by one. He couldn't grasp the concept that he was no longer fighting individuals. He was fighting an idea. The rest of the day was a cascade of incompetence on his part. First, he sent out a company-wide email, drafted by some high-priced lawyer in corporate headquarters. It was full of legal threats and corporate platitudes. It warned that any work stoppage would be considered an illegal act, and participants would be subject to immediate termination. Frank, our organizer, had anticipated this. He had the union's lawyer send a calm one-sentence reply to Arthur and the entire staff. A strike protesting an unfair labor practice is a legally protected activity. Checkmate. Arthur had just been publicly corrected on labor law in front of the entire company. He looked like a fool. His next move was even more desperate. He went after what he thought was the weak link. He called Liam into his office. Liam texted me right before he went in. Going into the lion's den. Wish me luck. I texted back. Just remember your training. Ask questions. Don't offer information. Be the reporter. The next 30 minutes were agonizing. I paced my small apartment, my coffee long forgotten. Finally, my phone buzzed. It was a long message from Liam. He tried to bribe me. He said he knew I was a key part of this misguided effort. He said he recognized my talent. He offered me a promotion, my own column, a huge raise. He said he would take me off the layoff list and make me his right-hand man in building the new ledger. He just needed me to publicly renounce the union and endorse his new direction. I held my breath as I read the last part of the text. I looked him in the eye and told him I'd have to run it by my union representative. He almost had a stroke. I think his eye was twitching. I just got up and walked out. The silent takeover was nearly complete. Arthur had tried threats. He had tried intimidation. He had tried bribery. Every single one of his weapons had been neutralized by the simple, powerful shield of solidarity. He was isolated. He was impotent. He was a general with no army, shouting orders into an empty battlefield. The quiet confidence was spreading through the newsroom. They weren't just a union on paper anymore. They had faced their dragon, and he had blinked. They were beginning to understand the power they held. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely collective resolve. And up in my apartment, I felt a grim satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about watching a bully discover, in real time, that the people he thought were his victims were actually the ones holding all the cards. The power shift began not with a bang, but with a phone call. On Tuesday morning, my personal cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered cautiously. "Mallory Kane?" A gruff voice asked. "This is she. My name is Frank O'Malley. I'm the communications director for Councilman Miller." There was a pause. "The councilman is concerned by some of the rumors we're hearing coming out of the ledger." Councilman Miller. He was the powerful, swaggering head of the City Planning Commission. He was also the central figure in Liam's investigation, the man suspected of greasing the wheels for the waterfront developer. This was it. The story Arthur had tried to bury was starting to twitch in its shallow grave. I chose my words carefully. "I'm no longer with the ledger, Mr. O'Malley. I'm not sure what rumors you're referring to." The man gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Let's not play games, Miss Kane. We hear you were fired. We hear there's a union now. We hear they're demanding you be put back in charge. And we know what that reporter of yours, that kid Liam, was working on. The councilman just wants to ensure that the ledger continues its long tradition of fair and balanced reporting. He considers the paper a key partner in the city's growth." It was a threat, wrapped in the thin veneer of civic concern. Partner in the city's growth was code for mouthpiece for my agenda. Fair and balanced reporting was code for kill that story about me. I said, "The ledger has a new union." "That's true. I'd imagine their commitment to fair and accurate reporting is stronger than ever. Perhaps you should call them." I gave him the number for the newspaper guild's local office. Then I hung up. My next call was to Liam. I told him everything. 2 hours later, the union put out a press release. It was subtle, but devastating. It didn't mention Councilman Miller by name. It simply stated that in the wake of their historic unionization, the Oak City Ledger newsroom was reaffirming its commitment to fearless, independent investigative journalism, free from any commercial or political interference. It went on to say that the union fully supports the paper's reporters in their ongoing efforts to shed light on the city's most important and sensitive issues. To anyone outside the loop, it read like a standard mission statement. To anyone inside City Hall, it was a declaration of war. It was a signal that the story wasn't dead. In fact, it was now protected. The exodus began that afternoon. The first to go was the waterfront developer himself. He pulled his company's entire advertising budget, a 6-figure annual spend. He sent a blistering email to Arthur, which Liam immediately forwarded to me. It accused the Ledger of becoming a radicalized anti-business tabloid. Arthur, in his panic, saw this as a weapon. He printed the email and posted it on the newsroom bulletin board, as if to say, See what you've done. It was another catastrophic miscalculation. To the reporters, it was a badge of honor. Getting angry letters from powerful people you're investigating is the entire point. Mark, the photographer, took a picture of the letter and posted it on his personal Twitter with the caption, "Looks like we're doing something right. #Ledger Union." It got 1,000 retweets in an hour. The public narrative was shifting. This was no longer an internal labor dispute. It was becoming a story about a newspaper fighting for its soul against a corrupt political establishment. The city's other, smaller news outlets picked up the story. Ledger unionizes, faces political headwinds. Powerful developer pulls ads from embattled newspaper. We weren't just winning the legal battle, we were winning the PR war. By Wednesday, Sterling Media's corporate headquarters in New York finally understood they had a full-blown crisis on their hands. The stock price hadn't moved, not yet, but the reputational risk, a term they understood far better than journalistic integrity, was skyrocketing. This led to Arthur's desperate counter. At 4 p.m. my phone rang again. It was Arthur. His voice was completely different. The arrogance and menace were gone, replaced by a strange, oily friendliness. "Mallory," he said, his tone oozing false sincerity. "Arthur Vance. I think we got off on the wrong foot." I said nothing. "Listen, I've been thinking. You're right, I was too hasty. The cuts were too deep. I was just following orders from corporate. You know how it is." I still said nothing. The silence was my weapon now. Let him squirm in it. He cleared his throat. "Look, I want to make this right. I've spoken with corporate. We are prepared to rescind the layoffs, all of them, and we are prepared to offer you a very, very generous severance package, a full year's salary, and of course a non-disclosure agreement. You can walk away from this whole mess, head held high, and with a nice cushion to figure out your next move." It was the classic corporate gambit. Try to buy off the leader and hope the movement collapses. It was also an admission of profound weakness. He was negotiating. He was desperate. I finally spoke, my voice as cold and clear as ice water. "The union's demand is not for my severance, Arthur. The union's demand is for my reinstatement." As editor-in-chief, he audibly sputtered. "Mallory, be reasonable. That's impossible. Corporate will never go for it. This is the best deal you are going to get." "Is that the company's final offer?" I asked, my tone clinical. He hesitated. Yes, it is." "Then you can expect to receive our unfair labor practice charge with the NLRB by morning, and you can expect a picket line around your building at dawn. I suggest you tell your remaining non-union staff not to cross it. Goodbye, Arthur." I hung up the phone. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was the thrill of the fight. The feeling of holding a royal flush when your opponent thinks you're bluffing. He thought he was offering me a golden parachute. He didn't understand that I wasn't trying to escape the burning plane. I was trying to fly it. It was never about the money. It was never about revenge. It was about the principle. You don't get to break something this important, and then just pay to have the problem go away. You have to be forced to fix what you broke. The power had shifted entirely. They knew it. And now, they knew that I knew it too. The call from corporate came on Thursday morning. The caller ID said Sterling Media Group, New York. The voice on the other end was female, crisp and devoid of any emotion. "My name is Catherine Bishop," she said. "I'm the Executive Vice President of Regional Markets for Sterling. I'm flying into Oak City this afternoon. I think you and I should meet." She wasn't asking. She was informing. This was a different class of operator from Arthur. He was a blunt instrument. She was a surgeon. We met at a neutral location, the lobby bar of a downtown hotel. It was one of those soulless, elegant places designed for transactions, not conversations. Catherine Bishop was in her late 40s, impeccably dressed in a gray suit that probably cost more than my car. She had the kind of calm, predatory stillness that comes from years of navigating corporate power struggles. She didn't offer apologies or excuses. She got straight to the point. "You've created a very significant problem for us, Mallory." she said, stirring a glass of sparkling water with a cocktail straw. I just looked at her. I didn't say a word. I knew my role in this scene was to listen. She continued, Arthur Vance is an idiot. A necessary one, at times, but his handling of this situation has been suboptimal. He fundamentally misunderstood the asset. The asset, that's what the ledger was to her. Not a newspaper, not a public trust. An asset, like a fleet of trucks or a patent on a piece of software. She leaned forward slightly. Here is the situation as I see it. You have an organized workforce, which is a complication but not an insurmountable one. You have a pending NLRB charge, which is a nuisance. And you have a looming public relations nightmare, which is a genuine problem. My job is to solve problems. I took a slow sip of my water. What's your solution? My solution is this. She slid a sleek, leather-bound folder across the table. It was a formal offer, a severance package that was double what Arthur had proposed. A glowing letter of recommendation, personally signed by the CEO of Sterling Media, and a consulting contract, offering me a ridiculous amount of money to advise another one of their papers on digital transition for 6 months, a clear bribe to buy my silence and cooperation. She said, You take this deal. You issue a statement saying you've resolved your differences amicably with Sterling. You encourage the union to accept the company's generous offer to rescind the layoffs and begin normal contract negotiations. You walk away a wealthy woman with your reputation intact. Arthur Vance will be reassigned. Everyone saves face. The problem goes away. It was the perfect corporate solution, clean, quiet, and transactional. It solved her problem completely. It just didn't solve mine. It didn't solve the newsroom's problem. It left the soul of the paper in their hands, and I knew what they would do with it. They would just find a smarter, more effective hatchet man than Arthur to continue the slow, methodical dismemberment. I looked at Catherine. I looked at the expensive folder, and I thought about David Miller. I thought about Brenda's pension. I thought about Liam's story. I thought about the trust that the newsroom had placed in me, and I started to laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. Catherine's perfectly composed face flickered with surprise. I'm sorry. Is something funny? I pushed the folder back across the table. I said, You still don't get it, do you? You're just like Arthur, only with a better suit and a bigger vocabulary. You think this is about me. You think you can buy me off. And the problem goes away. Her eyes narrowed. Explain. This isn't my fight anymore, Catherine. I'm just a symbol now. The problem isn't Mallory Kane, the disgruntled ex-employee. The problem is the Oak City Ledger Newsroom Guild, and they are not for sale. Their demand isn't my severance. Their demand is my reinstatement as editor-in-chief. That is the only solution on the table. It is the only way you avoid a strike. It is the only way you stop the bleeding. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a near whisper. You read the news. You see the narrative that's building. The brave little local paper against the corrupt politician and the soulless corporation. How do you think that story ends for you? You can't win. The only move you have left is to join the winning side. Reinstate me, promote me, and let me run my newspaper. I will make it profitable, not by gutting it, but by making it so essential to this city that people will pay for it. By doing the kind of journalism that wins awards and builds unbreakable reader loyalty. The kind of journalism your company has forgotten how to do. I stood up. The meeting was over. My final offer is on the table. You have my number. I walked out of that bar and didn't look back. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The vindication wasn't about seeing Arthur get his comeuppance. It was about this moment. The moment of speaking my own truth, backed by the collective power of people who believed in the same thing I did. The next morning, I got a one-line email from Catherine Bishop. Your terms are accepted. A formal announcement will be made at noon. Welcome back, Miss Kane. I didn't go into the office that day. I let the news sink in. I let the union have its moment of victory. Liam sent me a photo of the bulletin board. The letter from the angry developer was gone. In its place was a printout of the internal memo from Catherine Bishop, announcing Arthur Vance's resignation to pursue other opportunities, and my appointment as editor-in-chief, effective immediately. My final confrontation with Arthur happened by accident. I went to the office on Saturday to pick up a few things from my old desk. The newsroom was empty and quiet. As I was leaving, I saw him. He was standing by the elevators, with a cardboard box full of his personal effects, a stupid motivational poster, a set of golf balls, a picture of a boat. He didn't see me. He was just waiting. A man stripped of his power, looking small and insignificant in the vast, empty room he had tried and failed to conquer. There was no triumph in seeing him like that. Just a quiet, profound sense of an ending. A necessary one. The system hadn't punished him out of malice. It had simply removed a part that no longer worked. He had made himself obsolete. That was his failure. And my vindication. My first official act as editor-in-chief of the Oak City Ledger wasn't to call a meeting or send a memo. It was to walk over to Liam's desk. He was there, of course, even on a Saturday. He looked up at me, a wide, relieved grin on his face. I didn't smile back. I looked at his monitor, at the files and notes and spreadsheets for his investigation. I said, "Where are we on the City Hall story?" He blinked, surprised. "I'm close. I just need to connect the money trail, from the developer's shell corporation to the councilman's brother-in-law's consulting firm. I think I can do it in a week." I shook my head. "You have 72 hours. I'm clearing the front page for it on Wednesday. Give me something we can print. Give me the truth." His eyes lit up with a fire I hadn't seen in months. The look of a reporter who has just been unleashed. "Yes, Chief," he said. That was the real victory. Not the title on my door. Not the bigger salary. Not the quiet satisfaction of seeing Arthur Vance shuffle away with his cardboard box. The victory was that word, Chief. It was the restoration of purpose. It was the sound of the engine of a great newspaper roaring back to life. I spent the next few weeks rebuilding. We rescinded every one of Arthur's layoffs. Brenda went back to the copy desk, not as a woman terrified of losing her pension, but as the respected elder of a newsroom that had fought for her. Mark got a budget for new camera lenses. The union contract we negotiated was tough, but fair. It wasn't about exorbitant salaries. It was about enshrining principles into policy. We established rules for journalistic integrity. We created a committee to review and protect long-term investigative projects. We built the fortress back, not with one person as a firewall, but with the entire newsroom as its foundation, reinforced with the steel of a union contract. Liam's story ran on the front page that Wednesday. It was a masterpiece of investigative reporting, meticulously sourced and devastatingly clear. It didn't just connect the dots, it drew a map of the corruption at the heart of the city's government. The fallout was immediate. Councilman Miller announced he would not seek re-election and was under investigation by the state attorney general. The waterfront development deal was put on hold indefinitely. The story won a state press award a few months later. Liam's byline was on it, but we all knew it was the Ledger's award. It was the union's award. It was a testament to what we had saved. I framed two things and hung them on my new office wall. One was the front page of Liam's story. The other was the tally sheet from the union vote, the one he had texted me on the day I was fired. They were a reminder of what we were fighting for, and how we won. Not with anger or emotion, but with strategy, solidarity, and a relentless belief in the truth. So now I want to talk to you. The person listening to this right now. Maybe you're in a job where you feel erased. Maybe you're being managed by someone who values a spreadsheet more than your soul. Maybe you're the one holding it all together, the quiet, competent one who everyone relies on but no one recognizes. My story is not unique. The names and the industry change, but the dynamic is the same. There are people who build, and there are people who break. There are those who believe in a mission, and those who believe only in a margin. For years, I made the mistake of confusing my loyalty to my craft with my loyalty to my employer. I thought I had to save the institution from within, fighting a lonely, losing battle. But power is never given. It is only taken, and it is rarely taken by one person alone. The most profound lesson I learned is this: your value is not determined by the person who signs your paycheck. It is determined by your skills, your integrity, and the trust you build with the people you work alongside. An organization is not its management, it is its people, and when those people decide to act as one, there is no force more powerful. They thought they were just firing one troublesome editor. They didn't realize they were creating an editor-in-chief. It was never about revenge. It was about reminding them, and ourselves, of a simple fundamental truth. We were the newspaper, we were the value, we were the asset, and we were, finally, in control. So if you're in that place of quiet desperation, don't just get angry, get organized. Find your allies, understand your leverage, build your own power. Don't wait for a seat at their table, build your own. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if it gave you a little bit of hope or a little bit of fire, do me a favor and hit that like button. Leave a comment below, and tell me about a time you had to fight for what you believe in at work. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And please, subscribe to the channel. It matters. It helps to know we're all in this together.